Okay, hello. My name is Johanna Nalau from Griffith University. So I'm moderating this event on Foresight and innovation. So this is the official UNFCCC event that's focused on thinking a bit differently about climate change adaptation and futures. So you can see on the slide the speaker list. Unfortunately, Yusuf Nassef, who's the adaptation director, is caught up with the negotiations, but we have the rest of the esteemed panel here. So he's sent some talking points in terms of what he was thinking in framing this event. But there is often very strong cognitive bias in terms of how we think about future, what we think are solutions. And so one of the examples that Yusuf often uses is how the City Hall in 1914 in New York, they were discussing how to deal with horse manure in the following decades, or even when they were seeing automobiles being built and right in front of them. So we often hold on to these current problems without necessarily thinking how things might change in the future, and miss some of the future emerging trends that are right before our eyes. And how yesterday's solutions result in today's problems. So we can probably all think about a few examples of fossil fuels or plastics that we're now then trying to deal with. And how today's solutions also result in tomorrow's problems. So renewables resulting in geopolitical tension on critical minerals in the future, and resulting in waste disposal issues as well. So in the UNFCCC process, there is, so Foresight and future thinking is very much embedded in the global goal and adaptation targets as a steps towards Foresight-driven process. So it's defining actions versus a vision for the future and not the past. And so some of the kind of Foresight-driven activities in the UNFCCC are, for instance, resilience frontiers that sits under the Nairobi Work Programme, which is very much about challenging assumptions about the future. What does a resilient future look like? So the purpose for today is really about challenging assumptions. So we have 4 speakers that are going to share their insights and experiences. How do we envision futures? How do we exercise futures thinking and foresight for climate change adaptation in particular? And after that, after the panel has spoken, we can do a short Q&A, but we also want you to be engaged in this discussion. So we'll have a bit of a challenging assumptions exercise after this. So we'll move on with the speakers. So we have first Kirsten Dunlop, the CEO from Climate Kick.
Let me see if I can get this to work. Hello, everybody. So first things first, Climate Kick is a fairly obscure name to understand. So let me unpack it a little bit. The Kick refers to Knowledge Innovation Community. We are an organization grounded in Europe, founded 15 years ago, working all over the world. Our focus is on innovation to achieve transformation, human transformation. We address both mitigation and adaptation, and our particular interest, concern, and focus is systemic change, holistic and systemic, those 2 things not being the same things. So that means we do a lot of work to help whole cities transform themselves, to help whole regions adapt and build climate resilience, to work on land strategies, landscapes, the urban landscape, the natural landscape, and to work on industrial value chains that are embedded across each of them and the assumptions that underpin. So for us, well, I'm going to make this more a set of reflections. I understand that one of the things that we're really going to do here is use our time in this inhuman room to have a human conversation and a very kind of interactive experimentation reflection together. So I'm going to offer a couple of provocations. And I want to start with a couple of quotations which are interestingly opposed, or at least open up an interesting space in between. One is the future is dead. And it's a quotation that comes from an American pop artist playing with the idea that in fact the future does not exist, which is why in most ancient religions and cultures you have the notion of the seer looking into the future who is blind. The other quotation comes from William Gibson, and it is, the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed yet. Between those two holds a space, I think, of reflecting on the fact that what we are talking about with foresight is an activity of imagining how the extended present of our own choices and actions weaves together into the not yet here set of consequences of those choices and actions. In other words, the future is what we make of it and what we are making of it in every single action, choice, belief, assumption, and inadvertent reaction that we are enacting here and in every space in the world. The role of foresight, from my perspective, offers an enormous opportunity if it is understood as a way of constructing narratives of possibility off the edges of our sense of certainty. And I think that that becomes very acute when we pay attention to the question of adaptation and resilience. Because in the world of climate action, climate mitigation is a very normalized discourse. You hear in every single room, we already know what we have to do. The solutions are already here, we just have to apply them. The problem is we, in that sentence, and just, and apply. We are fundamentally irrational beings who make emotionally driven decisions based on our collective social consciousness and the way our context acts on us. We post-rationalize them into decisions that seemed logical and reasonable, and we do not act in ways that are linear. So for us to just implement a set of solutions holds a massive uncertainty, which we are seeing playing out literally all around us just right now. Just carries a whole lot of double meanings on both our naive assumption that this is easy and the questions of justice embedded in it, and apply the implementation gap, the massive middle between where we are now and where all of our best intentions and commitments suggest we need to be, is so vast and so complex and so embedded in deep, profound, and radical uncertainty that we need to come up with a different way of understanding how to engage. When it comes to adaptation and resilience, this is powered up to the power n. We are already beginning to understand just how little we understand about the implications of a warming world that hits 2.4 degrees at 2040 and 3 degrees at the end of the century, which is what we are on track at the moment for. I don't think we have no comprehension of what that does to the planet, to biosystems, and to ourselves. So the power of foresight in shaping our sense of how to travel forward, how to engage and how to act, is that it structures an activity of collective imagination and of collective imagining of narratives, of choice, of possibility, of forking moments, of acts of self that we are going to need to continuously work with as the horizon literally storms up in front of us. It's a little bit like understanding that our relationship with the future is no different to our relationship with religion. So my provocation into this conversation is using the language of foresight on the illusion that this is about knowing and controlling is extremely dangerous. Using the language of foresight as a way of understanding that the thing we're doing is knowing and controlling and understanding, more importantly, ourselves, that is an activity that is foresight is an activity that is slightly less tethered in the present that we're inhabiting it. It opens up a space for possibility, for flexibility, for options. It opens up a space of pulling in the full power of the imagination to anticipate things that we have not yet fully understood. And there are instances in history, think of the city of Florence in the 14th century, in the wake of the Black Death, that built walls for itself 8 times bigger than the population that currently existed, on an imaginative act of future possibility of restabilization, growth, and opportunity that did not exist for the following 800 years. But that's an act of collective imagination of possibility, and by that act of imagination, determination of the possibility of bringing it about. It creates a kind of neural pathway that begins to open up in our mind that these things could be. Can we imagine worlds of adaptation and resilience that are worlds in which we construct just, beautiful, and resilient realities, rather than worlds of adaptation and resilience that are disastrous humanitarian-led responses to endless crisis that we have never quite managed to get our imaginations out in front of? I think that's the opportunity for us to consider today. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirsten. And that's definitely the power of Foresight is in that imagination. Next, we'll hear from Eugenio Longo, who's the Sustainability Director at Tata Consultancy Services.
Okay, does it work? Yeah. Okay, so just a bit of background on Tata. Most of you must know or knows that Tata is a big Indian conglomerate. Tata Consulting Services is one of the biggest companies in the group. What do we do? Well, we're 600,000 employees, so it's a very large organization. And we do digitalization. So you must wonder why digitalization is so big. It's actually, there's even bigger groups than TCS, actually. It's because digitalization is being used to improve the efficiency of any system, of any industry, from the banking sector all the way to the food sector, automotive sector, mobility. This improvement in efficiency eventually brings a enterprise to transform itself. The transformation occurs because it gives so much insight on the enterprise, right? That the board of those enterprises are capable of getting insight for their strategic initiatives. And eventually, the nice thing about digital technology is that you can scale fast. And these are all things that should resonate when we think about climate and climate change, because we don't have a lot of time and we need to scale fast. So these are key words that we need to keep into mind. Now, if you ask me today, what are the problems? So what are the challenges about adaptation and how can we look into the future? There's many things we can say, but I come from 30 years of experience in the industry. And what has occurred in the past 100 years is an optimization in a very fragmented way. So we have supply chains that work in a linear business model where everybody's trying to optimize its own part of the supply chain. Okay, and all the externalities of this economy, of this linear economy, go into the environment. CO2, but it could be plastic waste or pesticides, herbicides that have other types of effects on the ecosystem. And everybody has been optimizing, and perhaps the most interesting, because when we talk about climate adaptation, we think about food production and infrastructure. When it comes to food, a marvel, I would say, of innovation was the invention of fertilizers. I don't know if you know, but more than 60% of the food we have on the face of this planet can be attributed to the production of fertilizers. And that's an invention that's only 100 years old. Before that, farmers and the entire population were living were victims of climate, actually, and they couldn't produce food in a stable way. With fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, all innovations that took place starting at 100 years ago, everything has stabilized in food production, right? So in this linear economy, everybody's optimized, so producing more with less land, producing more bread, producing more food, distributing more food, buying more food, and wasting more food ultimately. But that's another problem. So in this fragmented model, right, we have created this climate problem that we have today. So the question is, and this is what I like about the Cassandra dimension of what my colleague said before, you almost need a crystal ball about how will we adapt in the future, because that's the continuing story of humanity, right? We're going to have to continue adapting, and to adapt, you need more insights, okay? The extraordinary thing about technology today and digital technology is that this insight could exist, right? But there's a number of steps that need to be taken to get there. First of all, we need to move to an ecosystem economy. You could call it circular economy. I call it more ecosystem economy, because to do a circular economy, to make sure that there's no externalities within a system, a food system, or within a food system or distribution or even mobility, you need to have an ecosystem. And the ecosystem is no more one enterprise. It's a multitude of enterprises. And it's not only enterprises, because you're going to implement this ecosystem, and to make it successful, it's going to be cross-sectorial as well. So it will have to engage with other parts of society. Once you will have built this ecosystem, you will understand, based on all the data you will get from the various stakeholders, you will understand where the issues are, right? And the nice thing about digital technology, I'm sorry if I insist so much on it, because I come from the sector, is that digital technology turns things alive. It's not a reporting exercise. When you digitalize an enterprise or a system, you've got the data, and the data could flow back and forth. So it becomes an instrument of operability of your ecosystem. And this is very important, because you can do action. You could actually take action through your platform, right? Once the platform is constituted and is ready, you will understand where the problems are, and you could adapt much faster. Let me give you a simple example. Let's assume that the entire, olive oil industry would create a global platform. So all the olive oil producers of the world would get on a platform, and this platform would eventually understand the impact of climate on their business, right? So they would understand the problems, where they're coming, they could even model it, and they could actually compensate within their industry. So if they see that an area of the world cannot produce olive oil anymore, they can move their production, and they could actually finance it and ask for financing, because all the decisions will be based on true data, on high quality data. So digitalization also will provide you with all the quality data to get the financing and to drive your sector towards a new stability point, right? Ultimately, what digitalization will also give you, or technology, is a digital twin of your ecosystem. The nice thing about companies that work, or enterprises that work with a platform model, is that they have a digital twin of their enterprise. So they can take the digital twin of where they are, and this is where the Cassandra part, or the crystal ball part, comes into foreseeing, is that once you've got a model that you can operate offline, right, you can start injecting initiatives, science-based targets initiatives, or any form of business initiatives, to see what would happen to your ecosystem as the ecosystem evolves because of climate change, right? So these instruments are fundamental to go through the storm, right? The storm could reach the 3 degrees, right? We will perhaps eventually be in a storm that we will not be able to navigate. But between now and 2050, 60, 70, we need the digital twin of the sectors. Now, this requires a big change in the mindset, because we don't operate. We operate in a system which is very competitive. Actually, these same players, the olive oil producers, might even compete on the market today, not understanding that working together would solve their issues, their adaptation issues. So the mental step is there. And why do I say this? Is because I work with industry every day. I talk to, because we are a big digital company, we did digital technology for the biggest groups in the world, the ones that are at the interface between society and industry. And if I have to tell you how many companies think around the ideas that I just shared with you, it's a handful. There's very few, right? They still think of optimizing their own enterprise, right? And trying to navigate without the instrument, without the crystal ball, without the digital tool. So what we are encouraging, and this is our point of view on sustainability, that it's only through an ecosystem approach, cross-industrial, cross-value chain first. We're getting into that, at least in Europe. Cross-industrial and cross-sectorial is the only way out, right? And this is the way I would like to have our discussion today. For you to think about an ecosystem approach, you probably come from different sectors of the economy or different sectors in general. What would happen if you put all the stakeholders together and look for a new business model that revolves around what you do, right? Because there's so many things we do. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thanks to you, Eugenio. Especially, I really like your line, to adapt, you need more insights. That's definitely great. Next, we will have Xiaomeng Shen, who's the Vice Director of Europe and Director for one of the institutes at United Nations University.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Oh, good. Need to move closer to you because you are all sitting so far back. Hi, everyone. I really liked what Kirsten and also Eugenio said about imagination. I think that is really the key of having transformative change. I can give you an example of how our mind is stuck in our thinking. About 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, I did a study about flood risk management. And I interviewed local authorities for flood risk management. I asked them, why can't you create more retention area? Then you can release the pressure of building more dikes and stabilizing them, keeping them safe, because dikes are doomed to be breached one day. They said, oh, it's not possible because the population pressure is so big and economic growth has to be continued. If it would create retention area, we have to sacrifice economic growth. We have to move people, relocate people to somewhere else. That's going to be a huge economic loss. I thought that sounds all really logical, right? And then I found a literature about a policy suggested to the Chinese emperor 2,000 years ago, so 7 years before Christ. And he said to manage the flood issues on Yellow River, the best policy would be to relocate people somewhere else to create more retention area and not to fight with nature, not to constrain river of his from his natural course. And then the second one would be a compromise. The third one would be build dikes. So you can guess which policy was implemented, the worst one. The best one was abandoned with exactly the same argument of 2,000 years later. Population is too big, it's too costly, we cannot afford. And that would cause social tension, all of that. I tell you, the population back then, 2,000 years ago, was about 30 to 60 million people in the entire country. It's a big country. And population now is 1.4 billion. Same arguments. That's how stuck we are in our thinking. Because our thinking is quite linear, it has to be this way. That's why we need to challenge our assumptions, which is very difficult. So let's think about imagination. UNU is a research institution, is a think tank for the United Nations system, but also for its member states. And we want to think ahead of the curve and think differently and to be bold and to allow ourselves also to fail. That's where we need courage for different imaginations, how we design this world. We published a flagship report last year. We looked at 6 tipping points, how we are coming so close to various tipping points like groundwater depletion and urban heat. Our human body can only tolerate 35 wet temperature. Beyond that, we cannot survive. Our thinking is imagine ourselves to become ancestor one day. How could we become a good ancestor, not to accelerate climate change, not to accelerate urban heat and flood and all these disasters? So if we would have a time machine, we could travel back to 2000 years ago, or rather that our ancestors back then used the time machine travel to now, the present. What would they think? If I would be that ancestor, I would ask myself, did I do the right thing? Back then, 35 or to 60 million people, now 1.4 billion. Would I think that was such a big deal to move part of the 30 million people, not all of them? Was that a big deal? I believe not. If you really wanted to be a good ancestor, you would have done that for us today. We wouldn't be in this whole mess, right? Then let's imagine ourselves to be ancestors. Indigenous people think 7 generations ahead. So it's about 200 years, plus minus. Imagine we use a time machine to travel to 200 years ahead. This is not a weird thought. Indigenous people have been thinking this way for millenniums. And then we looked back and look at these people, you and me, might ask, what were they doing there? What were they thinking? They didn't clear up the mess, right? Because they couldn't change their mindset from fixing problems to transformative change. I think that's the key for any climate action, including climate adaptation, because we are fixated on the ideas of the previous thinking and we try to fix problems. Then we have been talking about the same challenges, like we don't have enough finances, we cannot measure adaptation goals because there is no one-size-fits-all metric. We know all of that for a long time. So let's start imagining a different way of thinking and different way of doing climate adaptation. Thank you. Oh,
I was just going to say thank you, especially on the point, the changing mindsets and how some of the cognitive biases can extend for, 2000 years. And I think that's really the spirit of the session today. It's how do we change our assumptions and mindsets as well. So next we have Kochikon Varakom, who has a presentation as well.
สวัสดีค่ะ so thank you everyone and thanks for all the 3 speakers. I think I really agree with all of them, and also I want to maybe coming into my context and talking about future and talking the future from the urban design perspective. So I think it's very hard for many of us to move to the future right away, like right now. And I think for me as well, like this is maybe in the past, this is the meaning of flooding, but is it working? Yes, but this is like my experience of the same meanings of flooding. So if someone come to me and let's imagine the future, I was stuck. And I think that's pretty much what all means and all the problems that we can imagine, but this is a reality that we have to deal with one city, the Delta city that don't want to get wet. And this is like the big whole water. So for me, I really agree with Xiaoming that we need to think future, but we need to learn the past and imagine that's connectivities. And so in business as usual, we flood other people's who also call Thai upstream and let Bangkok not getting wet at all. And we're expecting all this climate impact, sea level rise, and this is Bangkok right now. This is used to be land, actually within my lifetime. So to be able to touch the ground again, I have to go out from the boat almost like 30, 40 minutes. So what is the future? It seems so real that it can't be changed. This is, you probably thought that this is from one city, but it's actually from the Southeast Asian region. And this actually may be using a lot of data Foresight, and this is the result that we are at risk. So I'm wondering, like, what can I do to really expecting the unexpected? And we can imagine so many other things for the bright future. But I want to show what I have done and we have done on ground. And of course, when you talk about Foresight, you're talking about like a really far future and many other factors involved. But maybe the urban perspective probably be part of that. And of course, for all this process of selected expert and sharing all these scenarios, but for us, we're using like people who are part of the expert, but they are confronting with all this experience and within their lifetime, and of course some local experts. I think that's something that shifting from understanding very linear, top down, bottom up. Okay. So imagine one drop of rain used to come from the sky to the ocean. But right now, to imagine the future, you have to go through 50 government sector. So I'm sorry, I'm being a very real, like reality of the future. So I just feel like, no, and how can we be very hopeful about all this? Oh, this thing is not working. Oops. Yes, so this is the government sector. For the water, this is very top down. This is at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. Have to do this? Yeah. So I think from the top down, how can we imagine the top down and bottom up in this horizontal way? And this is the future because we kind of just neglect what we are having now, like having my two hands, having the history that I'm working on. So for us to really imagine the future, we have to do it with our people, with the top down, bottom up, all together in the horizontal way, and really create the map together to really understand and imagine with these people who probably don't even think about future that far, maybe just to survive the families for 5 to 10 days and be confronted with all these things. So I think foresight innovation is really good, but when it's come to practical, I think it needs another process to work with the foresight together. Oops. Did I go? I can't go back, but anyway. Sorry. Nope. Should I stand? Yeah, so I think like the present process is very important. I can imagine the future, but I cannot just forget like the cognitive or whatever memories that I have. And I think how can this thing like work together and benefit our urban context? So, okay, let's think about Xiaoming imagination, but maybe just only 40 years ago, this is like a leftover infrastructure, corrupted. There's a lot of this kind of things in my city, and it's been unused for 40 years. But at that time, we try to imagine with the local people, what can this structure be used and define the future for all of us. And the future create the present to reimagine what in the past, thinking about the future, but make it now. I think is about not just thinking about the future, but thinking about all connected. And I think to really benefit the majority, I think the foresight process innovation is really important together with many more stakeholders as local. So this is maybe normal for your city, but for the city like us that I show you what we have been through is this is maybe part of the future that needs to be continued. And we talk about this in adaptation realm because we are at risk right now. We are confronting this impact. This is the talk we did with together. This is the first park in 30 years. So first park in 30 years. That means like the whole generation not having a park. And at that point, we have to imagine the future, but the future is now. And I think that we need it now. So the park is not just the park, but it's inclined the whole thing to collect every drops of rain. Yes. So I think this is only 4 years. So I think really to educate people to understand the future by doing now is actually a very important, maybe a piece of foresight innovation to like sharing with these people and local communities in my city. I'm sorry. So this is only 4 years and you can really see the future. And only just 4 years, oh my gosh, I can shift my whole city if only I have enough space and enough plant and do it within 4 years. So nature positive cities and things can be possible. So this is the 30 years of not having a park. And now we can use whatever left in the past and change, make it right now. This is who? So he came to the park and helped clean the water. And I think this is our conversation back then that Bangkok is sinking faster than the sea level is rising. This is the future. This is the undenied future, but how can we shift that into the solution? This is another lot of waste space in the rooftop. Can you click for me? Is that faster? Yeah, just do. Okay, yes, I'm just gonna talk. And this is the rooftop. So thinking about reuse the waste space and then rethink all this, whatever we have in the past, but really feel about the future. This is the on top of the parking space. And this is in Bangkok. This is not a developed world. And now this is a government complex, and you can see how masculine, the linear, the grid, but we want government to be human. We want government to be feminine. So we just introduce something that can be future within the context and have people experience this thing. Yes, just go quick. Yes, this is canals. This is used to be historical canal looking like this for 10 plus year. But now just to clean that out, yes, just go. And I want to stop this. This is a reality of dealing with future with the government sector. We are from whatever government sector or institution sector, but this is all the people we have to deal with. Not only just selected expert, but also the real people who really practice. And just to change the sidewalk 10 meters, we need to break the silo of the real structure. Yes, just go. We really need to bring, I really like the foresight innovation, but I just want to make it bottom up more. And this is the real bottom up that we need to include these people. So present is so important, and we kind of forget the past. And I think the whole process of foresight will be benefits in the urban context because we need the real solution action using it right now, today. And so we can imagine helping people imagine the future alternative with an S, and not acting from fear, because we are very fearful from the situation that we are confronting as a nation and as a region. But we need to have this process to bring the courage. Courage doesn't mean you not fear. You still fear, but you act, right? You act in the right direction. And I think there's so many ways to approach flooding. This is one, and it's gonna imply 100 years of future that we're still doing today. Maybe we just have to stop, create all these concrete things. This is a new technology, and maybe people agree to invest on this. Probably not for Thailand. I don't know. I don't think it's fit. But to sucking in the carbon as fast as possible, maybe we need that. But this is another future that gonna engage us for. And this is another future that I think the last slide that we should invest. Thank you.
Thank you, Coach. That was very, very inspiring. And also, having to think about in terms of system change and how do we do Foresight when we have all those systems in place, and how we can change and move towards more shared Foresight and imagination. I wanted to open the floor now for questions and reflections on what has been said today. So we should have a mic. I think, do we? Yes. Okay, there's a gentleman in the back.
Hello, everyone. My name's Donovan. I work heavily in scenarios in the financial sector. I think this is great. I would encourage you to break the system more and think even more outside, where the future could be. Things that come to the top of my mind is like, imagine a world with no data, where data is actually the one that is actually causing the oppression, causing the way in which, the industry is controlling people. And so there's a revolution. And so there's a world with no data. So how do we adapt in a world with no data? Imagine a world where there's no milk and it's precision protein. That's 8 years away. So then all our plans on thinking about, the 108 million people in India who rely on their incomes from dairy is changed. So, I just try and push us even further thinking. Thank you.
Yep.
Hi, thank you. I'm Elina Van, and I work with the European Investment Bank. I guess just a reflection and I guess a question. What we see, thinking about particularly the uncertainty and the challenge of integrating uncertainty into decision making, particularly on investments. And what we see with a lot of our clients, even at the project level, integrating future-looking climate data is super difficult for many. We're trying our best to support clients to do that. But I think what's even, and that's at just at project level, but when you go into further sort of systems-based approaches, it even gets harder still. So I guess a question is, how do we make the link between the projects that we need on adaptation, on resilience, but also on everything we do to make sure that they're fit for a changing climate? And how do we link that then with these bigger systemic future foresight analyses? Because I think that link is not something I see, at least in my day-to-day work. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take one more question.
Hi, thank you. Sorry I came in a little bit late, but my name is Sarah Rosner. I'm the Director of Environmental Research at AllianceBernstein. We're an investment manager with 800 billion in AUM. And I was just wondering if you could comment a little bit on how you think about the financing element and what that experience was like, and what you'd like to see moving forward, particularly from the private sector.
Okay, any reflections from the panel? Yep.
Can I answer a couple of blend across a couple of those? One of the personal experiences that inadvertently led to my doing the role that I'm in now was working for many years with finance and insurance on building and constructing strategic innovation functions for those industries to conceive of the possibility that the future may not be an extended present and that really disruptive change would require those businesses to fundamentally change their models. And in the case of insurance, that's absolutely playing out. The entire industry model is just a question of time. So a lot of that work was predicated on having people really work with understanding uncertainty. And I'm just going to reflect on three principles, starting by a much, much deeper reflection into what the businesses themselves really are about. In the case of banking or insurance, really what are the needs you're serving and what explains why those needs exist and what you depend upon. But then on going through a journey of glimpsing into the future, but not choosing not to go down the full scenario planning route, but instead create multiple extreme snapshots of possibility. And do that by having executives, in this case, and boards of directors, do the work themselves. And that very much looking at very, very alternative snapshots. If you think of something like Black Mirror, or consider a white mirror alternative, one thing that has changed so many other things in the world, not as a prediction or a scenario, but just as an imagination stretching exercise, this is possible. And that comes back around then to the core principle of operating in uncertainty. If you're handling massive amounts of assets under management and a successful business predicated on exactly the kind of incremental continuous improvement norms that we have, you cannot afford to think in terms of plausibility. You have to think in terms of possibility. And if something's possible and you happen to be in a listed business, you are actually prudentially required to consider that possibility and do something about it. What it does is open up within private investment and public listed investment a requirement to generate alternatives. So if you're in the insurance industry and you know the entire industry cannot survive if it continues to hang on to a business model that fixes things when they're broken, because the breakingness is getting extreme and nobody can afford to pay, how do you shift the whole model towards preventing risk in the first place and lowering risk and shifting everything about what insurance knows how to do? Those kinds of major business model shifts are only possible if you go through an exercise of assuming that uncertainty is a norm, and a possibility begins to open up a frame for incorporating exactly the kinds of acts of imagination or acts of structured possibility thinking. My experience in terms of the financial management of that is a question of introducing the relationship between risk and opportunity. Because if your current revenue is worth X, the question you're ultimately asking is, are you so confident about the future that you can afford to hang on to that? Or is it worth dedicating 1, 2, 4, 10% of your present revenue to invest in the possibility that the future isn't continuous as you have experienced the past? And you suddenly require a strategic capital allocation to alternatives, to options, to exactly the kind of landscape architecture possibilities, urban design transformations. You are allocating strategically capital to hedging the risk that your certainty about the future may not be right. And if you really extend that out and think, for example, of, say, pension funds have a fiduciary obligation to ensure that pension holders have a pension. If there's a possibility that our economies, societies, and politics become so unstable that there's no stable enough economy to spend a pension in, then there's a prudential function that kicks in of 1, 2, 3% of assets under management to invest in a managed investment in a set of alternative possibilities, sponge cities, infrastructure, precision proteins, massive data sets, and artificial and digital twins that begin to simulate radical possibilities. And it really becomes that relationship between a counterfactual assessment of risk and a dedication of allocation of capital to explore and invest in possibility and the alternatives in possibility. And I think that's where Foresight starts to get a way of naming a prudentially either a prudential or an opportunity driven, doesn't matter where it comes from, investment in understanding how possibility is indeed manageable and investable.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really like the comment made by the gentleman. I'm actually very passionate about the topic because to really change the world, we would have to empower every individual. Every individual should understand the impact of its behavior on the ecosystem, right? And the wider ecosystem. But where I struggle with the first comment that you made was around data. How can I empower people without data? I'm working on a tool in TCS, but eventually where I empower every employee to understand the impact of what they eat, the way they move, where they shelter, right? So the basic needs. And I see an awakening, right? And this awakening make their changes, their behavior change. And I see the evidence of that. I see it because it's data that's giving me this evidence. So I fully agree that if we put every citizen at the center of decisions and we empower them through education and understanding, we could change the world. So the citizen is a. When it comes to financing, I have a lot of respect for all the work that's being done by the Morningstars of this world, the Morgan Stanleys that produce all this risk data. But it's a bit static. It's static and it doesn't really enable you to take very, very good decisions, strategic decisions. You need to make this data, I said it before, become alive, right? You need to capture data, create the digital twin, and then simulate the impact of adverse effects on the ecosystem. I don't name the bank, but a bank came to me and says, all of this is very nice, but tomorrow morning I have to decide if I lend €500 million to build a bridge in this country in Africa. Should I do it, yes or no, Eugenio? That's the question I get. And today you could take all the data of this world and say, well, is there a high risk, low risk? You're taking a very, very rough decision. If you don't have the real data, the digital twin of the situation you're in, and it's not only environmental, it's environmental in the impact of environmental change or climate change on society that you have to simulate. If you don't have a digital twin to understand what could happen in that context, you will not be able to do a very, very good decision, right? So it brings us back to the concept that the more we know about how a population, an enterprise, name it, will look like in a different context and simulate, then we will take better decisions.
I actually really like the proposal of no data in the world. Because I do agree with you that the digital twin could help us tackle all these challenges and managing risks. But I just want to mention recently I was at the Summit of Future and I had a discussion, a mini future lab at Columbia University with young students. And we imagined a desirable future with them together. In none of those futures they have imagined there was technology which played a role. So that's quite interesting. I think, like Coach said, there is a S after future. It should be futures and alternatives. So there are different options and pathways, and that can be very different outcomes. Could be a world without data, and we live happily ever after. So technology is also assumption. We assume we need it. We assume only then we could live a good life. Maybe not. I think that should be allowed, that kind of imagination of alternative universe. And no milk, definitely. UNU, my institute, has worked with a sci-fi author. We imagined the world without hunger. And we did identify a lot of food stuff alternative to the current ones. But people are having really hard time for that kind of imagination. How can the world be without hunger? But exactly that we tried out. How would the world would look like? What kind of social tension would still be? So that's again imagination.
Yes, I really like the second audience questions about the system and how we gonna do this with the system that we have. And I think that's kind of experience that I confronting as well. And I just feel like when I using diagrams of like top down, the bottom, and then shift it in this way, it doesn't mean that I'm shifting the system, but it just feel like I'm viewing from a different perspective, but working what we have, and just to think of changing system is already maybe very not imaginative. So I just feel like working what we have, but I finding like the imaginative way to linking that in such a very different way. Like I work with local government, I work with local people, working with a real expert, selected expert. And I just feel like I don't want foresight innovation just to be like a really top down kind of thing, like really well educated people coming and talk together. But I just want that to like can use that process with with people on ground who can't really imagine the future, but how can we make that process happen? And I think that it's going to be very powerful. But I have no answer. Thank you.
Okay, so we've heard from the panel. So we thought we'd do something a bit different because this is about innovation and foresight. So we've had the panel discussion, really some interesting ideas. Now we thought that we'll actually do an exercise with you. So the way, so we have about 25 minutes left. So this is a future scenario exercise, which it's called 100 ways it is so. We don't have time for 100 at this point. But so Caitlin's handing out some sticky notes, and what we would like you to do is to list 10 negative assumptions that are currently true about climate change adaptation. So we'll give you a few minutes. Don't worry, it's gonna end well, hopefully. So then once you've done that, we'll pick a few and we will flip them. So for instance, if we have a negative assumption or what we think is true about adaptation finance at the moment, we say, well, adaptation is never going to have enough money. So that is your negative assumptions. And then with the help of the panel, which you didn't know, we are going to flip them. So what would the world look like if adaptation had all the funding? How did we get there? So we'll give you a few minutes, and there is no right or wrong assumption, and we are not going to debate whether the assumption itself is true or false. And the panel gets to do that as well, if you would like. Okay. So since most of us have a lot of negative assumptions, so it's easier to think about negative things. So I'll we'll do 5 minutes. So you don't have to do the 10. You can do 3. You can do 2. Okay, so that is over 5 minutes. So what we thought we'd do is somebody who's brave enough or is very passionate about their assumption can start, and then other people can flip the assumption. So it doesn't have to be necessarily people from the panel. It can be anybody who can think how that statement would not be true in the future. So yeah, so the gentleman in the back.
I'm here just to always keep the things moving. So my negative one will be nature has no voice.
Okay, so nature has no voice in adaptation. So what would the flip side, if we flip the assumption that nature has a voice, what would that look like? Yeah, sure. And yeah, you can.
It's very simple to flip it. Nature does have a voice, and we can all be the voices of nature because we are nature.
Well, but we're actually working with a whole lot of sentient technologies and sensors and biosensors where nature absolutely has voices. We know perfectly well nature has, we're not listening to them, but yes, that exists.
Yeah, it actually, there is a voice. We don't listen, and we don't even develop the translation instruments to it. So there's a translation and we don't listen. So it's the worst of cases.
I have one dark thought. It says we will never be able to phase out fossil fuel.
To flip, nature has a voices. That's why natural disaster is destroying the human lives.
Okay. Yes.
I'm happy to repeat what I just proposed as a thought experiment. We will never be able to phase out fossil fuel. Please flip it.
Okay, so there's a gentleman who would like to flip the assumptions.
Well, I'll have a simple response. Let's try.
Okay, anybody else on the nature has a voice, or that we have phased out fossil fuels? If we flip those two, how did we do that?
Well, the technology is already there, so we just implemented it. It's like the nature has no voice. Flipping for the fossil fuels, the alternatives exist.
I would like to say something about fossil fuel because it's my initial industry. If nature has decided that the best way to carry energy is CO2, because the best carrier of hydrogen to produce energy or to extract energy is a CO2, we should think of how CO2 can continue being the carrier of energy. So I'm a very big believer that we're doing a monumental mistake to release all this CO2 in the environment. We should collect it, store it, and start using it to make fuels, right? Because it is what, we're trying to transport electrons by electrification. We're trying to transport hydrogen as a gas. A lot of people believe in it. It's necessary. In some industries, you need hydrogen, but to transport hydrogen at scale is a nonsense. Okay, it's dangerous. It's not sustainable. If nature has decided that to carry energy, you need a backbone, which is carbon, let's think about it and let's build this economy, right? And one day we will cry because of all the CO2 is in the environment. It would have been so much cheaper to just take the tailpipe of all these gas-fired power plants and store that CO2 somewhere, using it future feedstock to produce energy.
Okay, so let's hear some other assumptions from the audience. Yep. Oh, you've got the microphone. Thank you.
My assumption here is that let's assume that nature is not a determinant factor in our development aspirations. That's my assumption in terms of climate change. Because if nature is a determinant factor, they'll go strictly. But it's like we are determining what happens in nature. And that is what we are facing.
Anybody else? You can also leave the sticky notes. Perfect. Thank you.
The assumption is adaptation projects has not much economic return, so no one would invest it.
Maybe on this one, we were talking about offline about every time there's a flood, right, or destruction of vast areas, people most of the time they rebuild the same stuff, right? They rebuild the same buildings in the same place. You need to change. You will need to change, and you will need to find the way to adapt to a new situation. Let's see what happens in Valencia. But if they redo, you can ask for the money to rebuild the same houses at the same place, the same disaster will happen. And it's not in 30 years, 40 years like it used to happen. It will be 5 years down the road, because that's what climate change means. Disaster, more frequency. So.
Yeah. And I like this one because people might think that many of investment in the city, like parks, have no return. And I think there's so many incentive around the park that creates such a big, massive district. And if you go to the park we did right now, those areas actually create so much more money than before. And I think that there's so many intangible benefit that I think the world and many of us here are trying to perform of this adaptation or nature-based solution that is also impact in terms of the climate, public health, mental health, biodiversity loss, climate change is the same things. And I think that's, it doesn't mean that it's not value if you cannot count into the money. So I just feel that we need to help each other to count this thing out in finance term for now. Yes.
I think you could flip that adaptation finance one. You know, one way of flipping it would be at all point of lending, adaptation must be considered in end of story. You know, so embedded into the onboarding of all development. It's just one way.
Maybe actually just that is beginning to happening as a interesting, with difficulty, as an interesting requiring factor. But one of the initiatives that Climate Kick leads in the European Union is a mission to decarbonize 112 cities in the next 6 years by 2030. One of the interesting kind of front edges of that is to require every single solution to be built for adaptation resilience for a world from 50 years from now, which means you're going to have to build buildings for 50-degree heat and for storms happening like Valencia every year. And it is interesting how disconnected our worlds are, as indeed we were talking about earlier, to get two different departments to have that conversation, but you can put it in as requiring. So yes, that does flip it.
Perhaps on adaptation, I do agree that you know, we have always adapted, not climate change, to climate. Forget about the change, right? And humanity has always moved around and found the right places where they can produce food and shelter based on these changes. But I think it's more of a social justice topic, right? We've got people that have been living in a climate stable environment, and I've been living harmoniously with that environment. And all of a sudden, we're going there and saying you have to think about alternative scenarios. And that person, that population, has all the right to say, why should I be looking into alternative scenarios, right? And to adaptability, I think there's a limit to it, because there's going to be populations. Most population will question, why do I need to look for alternative scenarios? And this was one of my points: is why do we need to look for these alternatives?
May I? Yes, just a comment to the why people rebuilding the same things. That is an issue. I am from the United Nations University, located in Tokyo, and Japan has been hit by the natural disasters so much for the last few years. In the same place with this same earthquake, tsunami, and the guerrilla rains. And so people started to talk about really not just a recovery, but creative recovery, because they have really started to learn if they rebuild the same things, it will hit again and it will be destroyed. And there's no really the future. So it's really the nature has a voice. That's why with those impact from the natural disaster, people really started to learn how to recover in a creative way. So we just had a symposium and gathered over 500 people affected by those natural disaster area from different parts of Japan. And they are really, really talking about this creative recovery. They don't want to go back to the recovery, the construction, but has to build better from the natural disaster. So I do believe the nature has voices to have an impact for the human mindset.
Thank you. This is Dr. Muhammad. I'm coming from the Middle East and bringing the experience from there. So my question will be tailored for that region specifically. So coming from the GCC and the Gulf Cooperation countries, maybe you know that these countries specifically, most of its part are desert. So applying some adaptation models are very difficult to apply there. So compared to, for example, to Europe or others. So this is one of the big challenges that we face. And specifically, we run some models on the green, blue, gray infrastructure. So we found that the green infrastructure will be water intensive. So that's another challenge, because we face also the water scarcity, and we rely basically on desalination. So I think one of the significant challenges that impact the adaptation is the models that models should be tailored from region to region, and sometimes it cannot be comparable. For example, if you do model in Europe, can be compared to the Middle East. So this is what I believe in. Thank you.
Any reflections, responses? We have a few minutes also for assumptions.
Can I offer a reflection on the building back? Can I offer a reflection on? I just was one reflection. We use language like resilience. Resilience means going back to the state you were in. So if we want adaptation to not be about resilience, but to be about metamorphosis and transformation into a different state, we need to remember how much our language anchors us. I'm giving you another example. We do a lot of work on trying to change the entire the entire built environment towards bio-based materials. In Western cultures, we still tell a story to our children called The Three Pigs, which is a story that reinforces the idea from very, very early age that if you build in straw and wood, it will be ephemeral and dangerous. You need to build in bricks, stone. We have language references like make it concrete, meaning make it solid. All of those language references reinforce a worldview in which some of what we are building, living in, watching destroyed in front of our hands is better than alternatives that are unknown, uncharted, or feel like they're going backwards with respect to some romanticization of modernity. So if we want to really change the way adaptation is felt, we need to start introducing different cultural and language assumptions about opportunities for metamorphosis. Every disaster is an opportunity to transform.
Any other reflections? Yep.
Hello, my name is Khawla. I'm coming from Tunisia, North Africa. So I was like hesitating to be honest, to share this reflection with you because what the whole session and this kind of knowledge that is a very powerful decision-making tools that it's in this room and it's a part of a word. So I'm quite familiar with future thinking and so on. I has been trying to knock doors, to work with international development, public institution in Tunisia to use future thinking, scenario development or whatever, to build like a green city in 10 years and build plan that we can work on it on the preferable future that we want to be part of it. The idea that in developing country or the global south that I am part with, accessibility to such system thinking and knowledge, it's restricted. People don't talk this language. People don't see what I am trying and other people trying to convince them to do. So I find myself very comfortable, in fact, in this room, talking about and seeing example coming from Thailand. Thank you for sharing with us your concrete or tangible experience of how you convince a government to build up a park within their building. So my invitation, much more than reflection, how we could make this kind of decisive tools available for wider audience, available for like even for the design of international development intervention in different sides from the world. Foresight, future thinking is something that we need. Once I present this to international donors and he said, this is not important. So I guess even within highest and high level discussion and process design, project design, these kind of tools, they don't see it important to be shared and to be shared with different other partners from the world. And thank you.
I think we don't need to mystify foresight and futures thinking because we do it every single day. We plan what we have for dinner. We plan where to go tomorrow. These are all future thinkings. So maybe we should bring it just down to earth and to tell these people, you're planning your future every single day. You are creating realities. Then we should not mystify foresight, future thinking to make it too theoretical, because it's very practical.
I think the answer to your concerns, or perhaps some indications on how you could overcome those issues, is to think the way Thailand was thinking. So the top down, bottom up, forget about that, because you're going to confront yourself and it's going to short circuit, right? So flip it. Look, put it horizontal, put all the stakeholders around one discussion and capture the information from the stakeholders and start processing that information and then give visibility to it, to the ones that ultimately will need to take some decisions, right? Because there is a decision maker. But ultimately, I think if you're at I wouldn't say the bottom, but if you want to do something, is really building that platform, that horizontal platform, which was so well explained in the presentation from Thailand. If you do that, then it's so powerful that nobody in front will say no, right? It will have to listen to that platform. And that's a form of power. That, again, if you wish, today we have all the instruments to do it because these digital tools enable to capture the information. Before, you needed to get in a meeting room, you needed to put there all the stakeholders in a physical environment. Digital will help you catalyze this exercise much better. You could leverage the social media, or I don't have to tell you how to do it, but fundamentally you could do it.
Okay, so we have 1 minute left, and then we are getting kicked out. And before Chairman says, could you please leave your sticky notes? We'd be really interested, for especially those who didn't have a chance to read them. If you can leave them for us, all the negative assumptions.
Just want to give you another example because you talked about communities and normal people, right? We have been running a project in Latin America in 5 countries, 5 urban labs, and we work with local communities. We are basically doing a future foresight exercise with them. My colleague is here, Andrea. You can talk with her. Thank you.